The time has come. The greatest race on earth is literally next week. I wanted to do another bike prep video, a little more in-depth. Just because Grands is coming up doesn't mean this is the only time we do this. You should actually go through this whole procedure, in my opinion, before every big race. Mom and Dad spend a lot of money to get you guys to these races. So the last thing we want to do is show up to a race, have something going on with our bike, and could end up in a mechanical, whatever the case. Dumb stuff we don't want to look over, but it does happen. So let's get into it. Let's rip this bike apart, get it clean, and get it race ready. You never want to show up to a race with a dirty bike. So we're going to rip everything apart on this one and make sure not only is everything clean, but everything's working as it should, and we don't have anything worn out. Find something that's worn out, you take a chance of having a wreck like I did right before Grands last year. Alright, I figured taking the bike apart and talking about it as we put it back together might make it a little easier. Check out these sample NFRC hoodies, Napno Rodco. This is actually a sample we had, which feels really good. It's like an athletic material, but I'm not sure if we're actually gonna go to print on these because it's not really that warm. It's super comfy if I were to do gym or something like that, but it's cold in the shop and it's not that warm. It feels like I have a long sleeve on. Anyways, so first I'm gonna start with obviously cleaning the bike, but I wanna start with the bottom bracket because when you take the bike apart, the bottom bracket bearings are gonna be the last things you pop out. That is if you need to pop them out. In this case, they actually feel super smooth. This is the 11 bottom bracket, and ever since I've been on Chase, I've actually never had to even replace one of these. I obviously build a new bike every year, but these feel just as good as new. I don't really have a problem with any creaking in my bottom bracket, so I'm actually just gonna clean this really good and leave my bottom bracket in place. If you can turn your bearings and feel any kind of like bumps or little like hesitation in your bearings, there's probably dirt or grime inside there. As long as you have a good smooth slide in your bearings, you should have no problem at all. I'm literally just using an alcohol and water mix. That way we're not putting any chemicals when we don't want to have them. But once we're done, I'll probably spray some nice shine on it. But right now we don't want to spray anything extra we don't already want on the bike because we want to get rid of as much grime as we can. All right, bottom bracket's clean. Cranks, left crank, super simple. Just clean everything. We're even going to take our tie bolts out and clean in between the little creases right there. A lot of dirt comes out of there. Look at that. Q-tips are not only for your ears, they're for bike parts too. Splines are nice and clean. We want to clean those splines because sometimes you might have creaking in your crank and you go to pedal, you hear that just... Well, there's a few reasons that can happen, we'll get into that. But number one is you could just have grime that's worked their way in there, or you could even be dry metal on metal. You put a dry crank onto a dry spindle, there's no cushion in there, so that's why you need some grease. So even though everything's tight, there's still a little bit of movement that can make all this creak. We're gonna do a little dab on our bolts, move to the drive side, right crank arm. There's a little more involved in the right crank arm, right? We have our sprocket, we have a spider, we have 4 bolts, so we have a few more things we need to check out to make sure this crank is ready to go back on the bike. First, let's clean all this grime out of it. Crank arm is all cleaned. I'm not gonna actually take the sprocket off because I don't really feel a need to take the sprocket off. Everything is secure. We are going to check each and every one of these bolts because we want to make sure our sprocket bolts are always tight, because the last thing you want is a sprocket bolt to come out, because if one comes out, that puts all the stress on 3 of the bolts. And when I was younger, I actually learned from that mistake. 1 bolt came out and I actually destroyed my entire crankset because I came out of the gate and literally the 3 bolts couldn't hold it all. Tacoed the whole setup. So let's always check our chain ring bolts, all of them. Young kids, you might have 5. Check all 5, all right? This crank arm, sprocket, spider are all clean, right? But I'm gonna give you a little pro tip, which is a little more on the advanced side, but I think it's a cool tip to know to actually have a little more life out of your sprockets. Now, see on these teeth how there's a little bump on each one, right? So those little flares on each little tooth, they happen from all the force that you put on the chain ring when you're coming out of the starting gate. They're not going to be on every single one because at different points of your pedal stroke, you're going to be applying different amount of power. So when you might be at, say, 12 and 6 in your pedal stroke, there's not that much tension on the chain. But when you're at, say, 9 and 3, when you're really grinding out of the gate, you're putting a lot of stress on those teeth. The teeth are pressing into the chain is pressing into the material, which slowly pushes up a little material wearing those teeth out, right? So as long as your teeth aren't so worn out where it actually almost looks like the teeth goes from this to this, where the chain actually goes inside the tooth, we can actually pull a little more life out of this. If those little flare outs get too big, say you run a super narrow chain, what you're doing is making those teeth wider. So if your chain goes in between each tooth like that, nice and smooth, and then you add a bump in those teeth, well, it's gonna be like going in and like say where it catches my knuckle. It's not gonna go and fall down smooth. So you might feel a little grind in your chain. So what I'm gonna do is actually go and grind off each and every one of those teeth. And this happens on every single chain ring. I don't care what brand you have, over time, you're gonna develop little burrs on each tooth. And if you're not, then you need to do more squats and more sprints because you're not pedaling hard enough. Let's get those cleaned up. Good to go. Now, before you go grabbing dad's tools and grinding away at the teeth, be aware, it is gonna remove some of the color, all right? But we're here for performance, and I want my stuff spinning smooth. Now, before we go slide the cranks back on, we're gonna put a little grease right inside the bottom bracket. That way, that new fresh, clean spindle is not gonna go in dry and sit on a dry bearing. Put a little grease there, and I'm actually gonna put a little grease on the outside of this bearing. So when I put this dust cap back on, there's a little shield, so when dirt does squeeze in between those cracks, it's gonna get stuck to that grease before it goes into my bearings. I don't like to overly tighten my cranks. I like to go just enough until like right when the wiggle is gone. If you over tighten those cranks, push into the bearings, it's binding that bearing up so they're not gonna spin as free as they need to. So I actually like to have these as loose as possible, and especially with these Shimano DXRs, pretty much once that bolt stops tight, you don't even really need to crank on it. Now, if you wiggle it and you feel a little movement and you haven't tightened these pinch bolts yet, then it might just be in that left crank arm. So let's make sure our pinch bolts are tight. Check it again. No play. Spinning free. Next up, let's go ahead and just move on to the seat post. Clean your clamp. You'd be surprised how much creaking can actually come from these clamps. And I'm talking take them all the way apart. So you don't want to have just grease with dirt and grime in there, because every time you break your seat post loose, you're just grinding that in the metal. So eventually your seat post clamp is gonna wear out and you're gonna have to get a new one. Take care of your bike and they'll take care of you. I'm probably better about my bike now than I was 5 years ago because I have made mistakes. And this is my chance to tell you guys about my mistakes so you learn it earlier, learn it in your teens, your early 20s or whatever, so you can avoid making these mistakes later on like I have. We got the quick release clamp, right? And you got this little metal sleeve that goes in there. I'm actually gonna grease this when the clamp is pivoting on itself. It's not dry material on dry material. Good example. This has been the same bike I've been racing on all year. A little bit of wear in the anodize, but no indentions in the aluminum. I would actually put a little bit of grease where the seat post clamp slides onto the seat post. And yes, once everything's clamped, there's no movement here, but you'd be surprised how much torque we put through our bike when we're coming out of the gate. And all the torque and flex to the bottom bracket here does move up the bike. And I actually have had creaking that I couldn't track down for my bike, and all it was a dry seat post clamp causing all the creaking when I'm doing a sprint. Because remember how much force we're putting through that bike when we're sprinting. So as much as this feels solid, no matter what bike you have, there's always a little bit of movement. So grease those parts. We all know we want our seat posts tight, right? Well, as some of you have seen, Nashville this year, mine wasn't, and my seat post, while it was clamped, actually popped right out of my frame when I tap manualed to step up into turn 1. So another lesson learned, I always make sure this is tight. Break it loose, pull your race seat out, put your tall seat post in. Well, and with this being carbon frame, carbon seat post, I never just clamp down on it because you're taking a chance of crushing the carbon. But with that being said, every time I do take it on and off, it just came a little loose, and it just got a little more loose than it needed to, and of course popped off in the main event. Learn from my mistakes. You don't have to make them too. Moving to the back of the bike, we're gonna make sure everything's wiped down, really checking your bottom bracket by your chain tensioners. These chase frames, the chain tensioner is actually built in, so there's a little hole right here that I use my Q-tip, get in there, just pick out any really dirt. There's only a little 4mm bolt in there, but dirt piles up, so let's just try to get out what we can. Checking my brake pads, everything looks like I have plenty of life. Grands will be my last race on this bike anyways, so I'm not even gonna touch my brakes. Until I might start feeling air in my line, or maybe the lever pulls all the way to my grip, then I'll worry about it. But yeah, right now we're just gonna make sure everything's clean. I'm gonna put it right back on. Now sometimes, if you have hydraulic disc brakes with the fluid in the line, not a cable, if you have your bike upside down, sometimes if you do have air, it might kind of find a new home in the cable. So you might have your bike upside down in your car or whatever, and get it out and realize your lever is pulling all the way to your grip. Don't panic. Just pump it a few times, ride it around for a minute in the parking lot. Usually that air bubble will kind of find its way back to where it should be. It shouldn't be in there. Yes, you want to have your brakes bled if that's the case, but it doesn't mean a session is over. Pump them back up and normally the brakes will start working again. But again, it is something you want to have addressed if you do have air in the line. All right, put the brake back on. I'm actually going to pull the chain off and get that cleaned up. I like to soak the chain in gasoline. It really just kind of breaks down a lot of that gunk. If you're new to working on your bike, I don't really recommend taking your chain off at all, especially if you have a pin you push through, because you really don't need to be pushing a pin in and out. If you have a master link, it's a lot more safe. Just be careful if you take your chain. If you don't have to, if it's not that dirty, then go for it. I might only do this once, maybe twice a year. This chain is still pretty new. I don't want to put a new chain on because it's not necessary. All right, so I'm just going to give it a good clean, and we're going to put it back on and re-lube it. Let's go ahead and talk about pedals. Pedals, especially in BMX racing, clip pedals, they're important, right? No one wants to come unclipped. Then after my crash last year that I had, because of a pedal fail, I'm extra cautious about pedals, so let's talk about them. So I run the HT SX pedal. For years I ran Shimano clip pedals, and I had a little special trick that I could modify to make my foot stay in there a little better, but my whole career I had a problem with just coming unclipped. And at the end of the day, it comes from bad pedaling technique. If you're pedaling perfect, pulling your feet up and down on the clips, you shouldn't come out, because twisting your legs in or out is what unclips you, right? So if you have good pedaling technique, you should never have to worry about this. So it's not always the pedal if you have that problem, but if you did have some inconsistencies in your pedaling, which is very common for BMX because we're pedaling over jumps, we're all over the place. We're never in a situation where we can pedal just perfect. We're not road bikers, we're not cross country guys where we just have slow pedaling, right? There's a lot of movement going on. But all we can do is try to be the most efficient and have a good setup. Ever since I went to HT pedals, I have never once had a problem coming unclipped without there actually being a mechanical. Parts wear out, and last year I had my special race set of clips that I never changed. Those are my pedals I only use for racing, and they're probably over a year old. And what happened, it was actually the bigger platform pedal. So if you see this bolt, if you see that bolt just inside there, that bolt goes through and it's what holds the spring. Now on these smaller platforms, it's not, I've never even had the issue on these. I've only had it on the bigger platform, but that bolt over time works its way out. That bolt has a lot of tension on it from all this spring tension, right? And just all the riding and all the clipping, bolts come loose. So what happened was that bolt actually came loose, and I had been aware of that bolt coming loose, but I've just tightened it up. Well, in this case, what happened was that bolt came loose here, coming out of this side of the pedal. So when that bolt came out of the pedal, this whole thing released. So that releasing off my clip under my shoe, I lost all tension. So that's what caused my crash last year, is just not being aware of that bolt. I should have changed it already. It was my own fault. Another thing, everybody likes to crank down on our spring tension, right? You want to have it all the way in so it's going to hold you in. Yes, I get that, but I actually personally, I like to have it about halfway. Actually, when they're brand new, it's less than halfway, because I want to have room for wear. So the spring wears out, I can tighten it a little more throughout the year. As you can see, we're coming up on grands and we're only halfway there. Actually, this is my sprint set, but this is my race set of pedals, but same thing, right? Half tension, same setup. But with that being said, this is another good thing to look out for. Now, when we clip in, you see that little bar, right? So how this works is our toe goes onto the pedal, which means the cleat goes in that little bar, and then it pushes down, the back of the cleat pushes down onto that platform right there. That spring tension opens up with the pressure of pushing your feet, and your clip falls down in there. That's what keeps you from coming out. But that puts a lot of tension on that little bar right there. These bars do break. Again, it's wear and tear. And especially if you have pedals that have all that tension, you're putting more pressure into that bar, okay? And I've broke them, as you can see here. So this is my training set. Yes, someone's gonna have something to say about this. Well, I don't want to waste the full pedal when these could just be my sprint pedals, which they are. These are purely for sprints out in a safe area at my sprint spot. So I actually grind them down smooth, and before I clip in, I look down and make sure it's not that side, and I'm clipping in to this side. I'm not recommending do this. I mean, it works great for me, to be honest, but you just have to be extra aware of clipping in. Obviously, if you clip into this side, your foot's gonna slide off, but the point of this whole ramble is pay attention to that little bar, okay? If these have cracks or anything in them, they will break. And when stuff fails, it likes to fail right before a main event. It's not gonna do it first moto or second round or an easy moto. It's gonna happen in the main event. So let's make sure that doesn't happen, all right? We're gonna pull out the race set. Let's ramble on a little more, because I know you guys are gonna ask, Barry, what's all that crap on your pedal, right? This is a trick I used to do with my Shimano pedals. I actually used to use zip ties. So when you clip in and there's a little room between the bottom of your shoe and the pedal, you might feel a little hover, right? A little movement in your pedal. So what I would do is put those zip ties, especially back when we used to run the Vans clip shoe, the cleat literally stick out the bottom of the sole. So there was so much gap in between here. And we want to have our whole foot on this platform as much as possible, right? To give all that force through our pedal coming out of the gate. There's only a couple millimeter space between the bottom of the shoe and the pedal, but it's just enough little movement that I don't like. So I take a little bit of JB Weld. You guys can see how it's raised up just a little bit. Just helps eliminate that little movement from the shoe and the pedal contact. We're gonna add a little grease right there to the spindle, and we're gonna put these pedals back on. You don't have to crank down on these cranks. If you want to, go for it, but I just give it a little snug. Good to go. It's not going anywhere. Let's talk about flat pedals for you flat pedal riders real quick. Pretty simple, not much to look over, right? If you wiggle the spindle should be pretty tight. You don't want it sloppy or the pedal moving back and forth on the spindle. Same goes for the clips. And we're gonna check every single pin. So if any of these pins are loose, they're gonna fall out. And if they're loose, you probably actually already have some that might be missing. So just check your pins if you're on flat pedals. Flat pedals are simple. You wanna have a good shoe. If your shoe is super worn out, we all have that one spot we like to keep our foot on the pedal. So you'll probably have a good wear in the area of the sole of your shoe. Be aware of that as well. We want to have maximum grip on our pedals, right? So let's make sure all our pins are in our pedals and our shoes have plenty of rubber to really bite down. Moving to the front, be aware of where all your spacers lie. Like for example, the top bearing has a little race that falls inside. It fits nice, and I have this super thin little washer in between that. I'll get into that in a minute, but just keep track of how you take everything off. So you don't want to mix those up because you don't want to put everything back together and it be a little different than how you took it off, right? Now that I got everything off, I wiped out the cups so everything's super clean. We're gonna add grease and start by putting the bearings in first. Doesn't have to be anything crazy, just a good coating across all surfaces. Make sure you clean your bearings off because, as you'll see when you take it off, I like to put grease on the outside. Not that the grease is actually going in there to help it move, but the grease actually acts as a barrier, so when the dust comes in, it sticks to that grease instead of working its way down in the bearing. Headset is super simple, but we're gonna grease every layer. There's so many little washers that go in here, so grease the head tube, put the bearing. Now the bearing's in there, we're gonna grease the bearing where this little piece sits right down in that bearing. And again, not metal on metal, right? Now sometimes these caps that go over the top bearing, there's a little rubber seal right on the edge there just to help keep dust out. Sometimes when you crank down your headset, depending on what headset you have, sometimes that gets really tight and might make it stiff. So there's this little paper thin washer, and I like to put in there. Just, it's not enough to open that gap to where the little dust shield doesn't work, but yeah, it's just enough to keep the tolerance just enough that when you crank down your headset, it's not binding it all up. These Icon forks, the bearing race actually is built in, which is just one less thing to remove, one less thing to clean, and it's as simple as wipe it down, lube it back up, and stick it in. Putting all that on, you're probably gonna get grease on your steer tube, and it's really not that big of a deal. This kind of contradicts everything I said, right? But I don't like to grease the steer tube. I could be completely wrong on this, but I just don't like greasing the steer tube because even though everything clamps down, it's all such a smooth surface. I just think that gives it the chance to, my bars slip one day I crack, I don't know. Maybe that's just, I'm in my own head about that, but I like to run the steer tube dry. That's the only thing I really run dry is the steer tube because I don't want any chance of my bars slipping, simple as that. I removed my pinch bolts on the stem just to clean out the dirt that was behind that, but I did not move my handlebars. I don't really like messing with my handlebars. I just made sure all 4 of those bolts were tight. They were tight. It's very rare they come loose, but just check the bolts that actually hold the handlebars on because obviously you don't want your handlebars to slip. Snug those up really good. The Icon fork has a built-in stem lock. I wiped it down, re-greased it. Our pinch bolts for the stem are still loose because we gotta tighten that bolt, which pulls everything together. But now my handlebars aren't straight. So I'm gonna leave those loose until I get the front wheel on. Brake lever is clean. You can't beat the ruffians. These are like an OG ODI grip. Fresh logo. Now move to the wheels. We need our transponder. They never look good sitting on the outside of your fork like that, right? So I took an old tube, cut a bunch of sections so I had spare. The tube is just double the length of the transponder, and what I do is actually put the transponder inside the tube and slide that over my fork leg, and everything is nice and clean. Now, doesn't that look better? I like to clean the hubs when they're off the bike, just you have a little more room. So I run the Onyx SS hub. So you can break this little bolt loose, unscrew that outer piece, and slide the axle right out because it's a hollow hub. All right, so dirt gets down there, we want to clean that too. I know these parts ain't cheap, so might as well make them look good every time we use them, right? Again, you don't want to over tighten this. Just go until it stops. I mean, you can't get much leverage with your fingers anyway, so once it's tight with your fingers, that should be good. Tighten the pinch bolt back up, and it's good as new. I'm gonna rotate, this is just me being OCD, the bolt that we were just loosening, I'm gonna rotate it to the back. That way you don't see it. I don't like when you look at my bike, if you see like bolt heads, if I can hide them, I like to hide them. It gives it just a cleaner look, you know? We're not gonna put new tires on because really, they're still good. But we will talk about new tires because when you do put new tires on, all tires have like a, not a coating, but the fresh rubber, there's like a glaze to it. So you never want to put a brand new tire on and go straight to racing because it's going to be a little slick. Get some track time on it so that that fresh top glaze kind of wears off. My front is a Maxxis Torch 1.95. I run the Torch in the front because I like the side grooves. I like it's got the smoother center for less rolling resistance. It's got the side grooves. That way, when you're leaning in a turn, it's got like, think of it like it's just got something to bite to. You know, when you're leaning in the asphalt, all the forces go in this direction, so there's grooves to grab. Does that make sense? That's why I run the Torch in the front, because the DTH doesn't have that side groove. Back wheel, just gonna be the same process. A little more things to keep an eye on. The cog, same way as the front. We're gonna scrape off the gunk, knock off those burrs if they're there. If you have disc brakes, we're gonna make sure all our rotor bolts are tight. Same way, I'm not putting a fresh rear on. I run the Maxxis DTH 1.75 in the rear because I actually like the back and forth groove for the rear. Yes, the solid center bead down the middle is supposed to be less rolling resistance or roll faster or whatever, but especially leading into Tulsa, you know, I like to think as much as we're just smashing on those pedals out of the gate, we want to have the most traction out of the gate, right? If we spin at all out of the gate or in your first couple pedals, you've just ruined your whole first straight, right? So I just like to think the back and forth grooves in the DTH is gonna allow, when you come off the asphalt and you hit the dirt, it's just, even if you have asphalt or concrete that's got a little bit of dirt on top, I feel like it's just got a little more rubber that can hit and fold and grab on that surface. Especially going into Tulsa, we're gonna come off the gate straight into dirt. There is no asphalt or concrete right out of the gate. So you go straight from grippy gate surface straight to dirt surface, and you hope it's been swept. So if once your tire rolls off that grippy surface, you want it to grab every little bit of dirt or bumps or whatever the case, so you're always pushing forward and not spinning. Does that make sense? So that's why I like going with the DTH. I will forever run the DTH on the back. Not saying those smooth treads like the Torch, not saying it doesn't work in the rear. We're talking minor stuff, right? I very rarely spin on whatever tire I have, but we always want those extra 1%. That's how I process it in my head. You know, I like the DTH because I think it grips the dirt a little better. And most tracks nowadays are soil tack or concrete or asphalt all the way to the first jump, but not Grands. Grands is as BMX as it gets, straight out of the gate, straight to dirt. So I want to make sure my tire is hooking up. And it's as simple as that. Give it a little buff, throw the chain on, wrap this up. You know, with all that being said, you can actually see the difference on where each knob grips compared to the other one. You have a nice sharp edge here, and on the front of each groove, the part that would go down and hit the dirt, you can see how the edge is just worn off, so you know it's really doing its job. And finally, chain is looking nice and clean, moving nice and free, not all lumped up. It was so caked with just dirty grease and grime. What I love about BMX bikes nowadays with these through axles, you never have to change your chain tensioner. The chain on, and it slides right back in the dropout, exactly where it was when we took it apart. Boom. Remember, our chain's been soaking in gas, so it's nice and dried out, so we need to go back and lube it up. There it is. Oop. Gotta tighten these bars. Now, race ready. Everything's tight, everything's lubed. My tire pressures are right. Make sure you check your tire pressure. My tires are ran at about 100 in the rear, 90, 95 in the front. Looking just like the day I built it 11 months ago. All right, that's a wrap. My bike is officially ready for the greatest race on earth. I hope yours is as well. We're only a week away from Tulsa, so we'll see you all there. I hope I made it simple enough for you. Make sure that bike is dialed. You want to make sure it's 1% better than that rider on the gate next to you, right? 9.5 merch, it's all available on 95rideco.com. The link is below. If you're not subscribed, hit that button. Subscribe for me. I really appreciate it. And that's a wrap. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks for tuning in. Peace.